an alien queen's roar shattered reinforced glass panels above, raining crystalline shards onto greasy hangar plating. "Who fixed my armor?" she bellowed, her voice a bone-rattling frequency that made teeth ache. 200 captive mechanics hit cold, grease-stained grating, praying to whatever gods they had left. But one human didn't kneel. He just wiped a smear of neuro-coolant off his cheek using one blistered hand, tightened his grip on a heavy steel spanner, and stepped forward. He wasn't a hero, he was just an engineer who hated shoddy craftsmanship. The air in Hangar Bay 4 always tasted like pennies and burnt hair. Cole chewed on the inside of his cheek, tasting real copper to match the phantom flavor in the air. He lay on his back, the freezing steel of the deck biting through his thin, oil-soaked jumpsuit. Above him loomed the undercarriage of a Kalan dropship, a monstrosity of jagged edges and dark, light-swallowing metal. He wrenched a bolt loose. Searing hot hydraulic fluid spat onto his collarbone. Cole didn't scream. He hissed, biting down hard, and wiped the burning liquid away with a rag that was already saturated with worse things. You learned not to scream in Hangar Bay 4. Screaming drew the attention of the overseers, and the overseers didn't like noise that wasn't industrial. "Shift's almost over," Dean whispered from the adjacent repair bay. Dean was a pale, skeletal man who used to be an architect back on Earth. Now he was just another pair of hands, his fingers permanently stained black from carbon scoring. "Don't care," Cole muttered, spitting a fleck of grit from his lips, spindles still warped. "If I don't realign the magnetic housing, this thing drops out of orbit the second it hits atmosphere." "Let it," Dean said, his voice dropping to a harsh rasp. "Let the bugs burn. If they burn, they blame the last guy who touched it. That's me. I prefer my skin attached to my muscles, Dean." Cole rolled out from under the dropship, his joints popping in a staccato rhythm. He was 34, but his spine felt 60. He stood up, wiping his hands on his thighs, leaving streaks of luminescent green grease. The Kalan Empire had conquered Earth's outer colonies 3 years ago. They were a terrifying species, bipedal, vaguely insectoid, but with the density and mass of a rhinoceros, clad in natural chitin that could stop standard ballistic fire. But for all their biological superiority and devastating energy weapons, the Kalan were terrible engineers. They built things to last forever, which meant they never built them to be repaired. When a Kalan dreadnought took damage, they didn't know how to patch it. They just threw raw materials at the problem or scrapped the ship until they captured humans. Humans, with our frail bodies and short lifespans, had mastered the art of keeping broken things alive. A siren blared, a deep synthetic horn that vibrated in Cole's chest cavity. The hangar bay doors groaned open. The vacuum of space was held back by a shimmering pale blue atmospheric shield. A Kalan royal transport drifted through the barrier, its hull scorched and smoking. The ship was a mess. Half of its port thrusters were sheared off, trailing frozen plumes of atmosphere. "Hell," Dean breathed, backing away from his station. "That's a sovereign's escort." Cole squinted through the hazy air. Kalan society was strictly hierarchical. Workers, warriors, commanders, and at the absolute peak, the sovereigns, queens of their respective armadas. To see a sovereign's transport in a makeshift repair bay meant something had gone catastrophically wrong on the front lines. A platoon of Kalan warriors marched down the transport's ramp before it even fully settled on the deck. They were massive, their mandibles clicking in agitated, violent rhythms. Between them, they carried a heavy grav pallet. The overseer of Hangar Bay 4, a scarred Kalan with one milky eye, scuttled forward, his posture immediately subservient. The lead warrior from the transport barked a string of guttural clicks and chitters. The overseer flinched. Then, the overseer turned and pointed one massive, clawed digit directly at the human work pens, directly at Cole. "Ah, hell," Cole whispered. His stomach dropped. The cold dread pooled in his boots. 2 warriors hauled the grav pallet over to Cole's station and dumped it onto his work table. The impact cracked the reinforced synth glass of the table. The aliens didn't say a word. They just leveled a plasma rifle at Cole's chest, chattered a warning that he didn't need to speak their language to understand, and backed away. Cole approached the table slowly. It was armor, but not the standard mass-produced plating the infantry wore. This was sovereign armor. It was an intricate, terrifying work of metallurgy, forged from an alloy that seemed to drink the ambient light. It was designed to fit a creature easily 9 feet tall. but right now it was trash. A massive plasma blast had melted through the central chest carapace. The edges of the wound were jagged, still radiating a faint, sickening heat. The underlying microcircuitry was fused into a slagged mess of silver and gold wires. Dean crept up beside him. "Is that—" "The Queen's," Cole said, his voice hollow. "It's slagged, Cole. You can't fix that. The structural integrity is gone. Even if you patch the hole, the moment a kinetic round hits it, the whole chest plate will shatter like glass." Cole reached out, hovering his hand over the scorched metal. He could feel the residual heat baking his palm. He ran a thumb over the unblemished edge of the armor. It was impossibly smooth. It wasn't forged, it was grown. Kalan metallurgy relied on nano-weaving. The Kalan engineers wouldn't touch it, Cole realized, his chest tightening. If they try to fix it and fail, the Queen kills them, so they dumped it on the human slaves. When it breaks again, they just blame the monkeys. "So we're dead," Dean said flatly. Cole picked up his spanner. The metal was heavy, solid, familiar. He looked around the hangar. 200 humans, starving, tired, broken. If this armor failed, the Queen wouldn't just execute the mechanic, she'd vent the whole bay. Cole hated the Kalan. He hated their arrogance. He hated this stinking hangar. But more than anything, looking at the ruined, beautiful armor on the table, he hated the idea of a half-assed repair job. "Get me the cutting torch," Cole said, "and bring me all the depleted uranium plating from that wrecked human cruiser in Sector 7. Dean stared at him. "You're going to patch alien royal armor with human scrap?" "I'm not going to patch it," Cole said, slamming his spanner onto the table. "I'm going to make it work." By hour 12, Cole couldn't feel his fingers. His hands were wrapped in thick thermal tape, but the heat from the plasma cutter bled right through, cooking his skin. The hangar bay was asleep, plunged into a dim, amber, low-power cycle. The only sound was the low hum of the life support scrubbers and the violent hiss-crack of Cole's torch. He cursed violently as a spark of molten slag bounced off the table and bit into his cheek. He smacked his own face, smearing sweat and soot, and killed the torch. "Stubborn, stupid, arrogant bugs," Cole muttered, coughing into the crook of his elbow. His lungs felt lined with sandpaper. He leaned over the armor. The alien metal, whatever the hell it was, refused to bond with human alloys. Every time he tried to weld the depleted uranium plating over the breach, the Kalan metal repelled it. The thermal expansion rates too vastly different. The welds would hold for 3 minutes, then crack with a sound like a gunshot. He had tried 4 times. His work table was littered with cracked, useless sheets of dense armor. He slumped onto a stool, popping the seal on a ration pouch. It was a gray, gelatinous paste that tasted like heavily salted drywall. He forced it down, staring at the gaping hole in the breastplate. Why did it fail in the first place? He picked up a flashlight and clicked it on, shining the harsh white beam into the melted cavity of the armor. The Kalan built everything thick, monolithic. They believed that more mass equaled more protection, but the plasma blast had just cooked the plate until it gave way. "You idiots," Cole whispered, a bitter smile cracking his chapped lips. "You don't know how to bend. You only know how to stand still." He stood up, kicking the stool backward. He didn't need to bond the human metal to the alien metal. He needed to suspend it. He walked over to a pile of scavenged junk Dean had dragged over earlier. He dug through it until he found what he needed: a suspension shock system from a heavy cargo rover, thick coiled springs and kinetic dampeners. "You want to stop a blast," Cole said to the empty room. "You don't just put a wall in front of it. You break the energy." He fired up the torch. The next 8 hours were a blur of blinding light, noxious smoke, and a pain in his lower back that made him want to vomit. He stopped trying to make the repair look seamless. There was no point. Instead, he hollowed out the melted edges of the Kalan armor, using a heavy grinder that vibrated so hard it made his teeth chatter. The screech of human tungsten grinding against alien chitin was deafening. He bolted the kinetic dampeners directly into the solid inner ridge of the carapace. Then, he took the depleted uranium, dense, heavy, ugly as sin, and forged it into angled, overlapping scales rather than one solid block. He bolted the scales to the dampeners. It was a technique as old as tank warfare on Earth. Spaced armor, angled to deflect rather than absorb. When a plasma bolt hit this patch, the outer uranium scale would superheat and shatter, dispersing the thermal energy. The kinetic force would be eaten by the shock absorbers before it ever touched the Queen's flesh inside. It was brilliant. It was ugly. The original armor had been smooth, obsidian dark, and regal. Cole's repair looked like a brutal, jagged scar. The thick grey slabs of human metal jutted out aggressively from the sleek chest plate, held together by massive, ugly industrial bolts. It looked like someone had grafted a bulldozer onto a sports car. Cole finally killed the torch. The silence in the bay rushed back in, ringing in his ears. His vision was swimming with green after-images from the plasma arc. His hands were shaking uncontrollably. He stripped off his heavy leather gloves. The skin on his knuckles was blistered red, weeping clear fluid. He leaned heavily against the table, his forehead resting against the cool, unmarred section of the alien armor. The smell of burning flux and ozone was permanently etched into his sinuses. He felt a deep, overwhelming exhaustion, the kind that makes you want to lie down on a dirty floor and never get up. Dean walked up, holding 2 cups of synthetic coffee. He stopped, stared. "Cole," Dean said slowly. "What the hell is that?" "Spaced kinetic plating," Cole rasped, his voice barely a croak. He took the coffee with a trembling hand, spilling half of the scalding liquid onto his boots. He didn't flinch. "It's hideous," Dean said, terrified. "Cole, it looks like a junk heap. She's going to execute you for defacing royal property." "Let her try," Cole said. He took a sip of the coffee. It tasted like battery acid, but the caffeine hit his bloodstream like a spike. "It won't break. That's what matters." "They don't care if it works, if it looks like an insult," Dean hissed, looking around frantically, as if the guards were already marching over. "You bolted tractor parts to the Sovereign's chest plate." "Because their design is garbage," Cole snapped, a sudden flash of anger cutting through his fatigue. He slammed the cup down. "They think they're gods because they have bigger guns, but they're stupid, Dean. They build things to look terrifying, not to survive. This," he slapped the ugly, jagged uranium scales. The metal rang with a dull, heavy thud. "This survives." The bay doors at the far end of the hangar suddenly shrieked as their heavy locks disengaged. The low-power amber lights instantly snapped to blinding clinical white. Alarms began to chime, not the warning siren, but a rhythmic, descending tonal sequence. Dean went completely pale. "The royal procession, she's here." Cole looked down at his hands. They were covered in soot, blood, and grease. He wiped them on his thighs, took a deep breath of the stale, metallic air, and turned to face the doors. "Well," Cole muttered, feeling the phantom ache in his spine throb in time with his heartbeat. "Let's see if she prefers being pretty or being alive." The Sovereign did not walk so much as she devastated the space she moved through. She was nearly 10 feet tall, a towering monument of organic devastation. Her natural chitin was a deep, iridescent purple that shifted to black in the shadows. 4 primary ocular receptors glowed with a faint, predatory amber light. With every step she took, the heavy steel deck plates groaned, protesting the immense density of her frame. Behind her flanked a dozen elite royal guards, their weapons drawn and humming with lethal violet energy. But the Sovereign didn't need them. She radiated an aura of absolute crushing authority. Cole stood by his work table. The rest of the hangar had frozen. 200 human mechanics had dropped to their knees, pressing their foreheads against the cold, filthy grating. Dean was on the floor beside the table, trembling so hard his teeth clicked. Cole didn't kneel. He didn't have the energy. His knees locked, his back screaming in protest. He felt numb. Fear was there, certainly. A cold, sharp needle at the base of his skull. But it was buried under layers of exhaustion and a bitter, stubborn pride. He just stood there, leaning slightly on his heavy spanner, watching the monster approach. The Kalan overseer, the one who had condemned Cole to this task, rushed forward to meet the queen. He threw himself onto his belly, chittering frantically in their native tongue. Cole didn't need a translator. The overseer was groveling, pointing his jagged forelimb at Cole. At the table, shifting the blame. "The human did it. The filthy animal ruined your sacred armor." The Sovereign ignored him. She stepped right over the prostrate overseer, not even looking down. She stopped in front of Cole's work table. Up close, the smell of her was overwhelming. It wasn't the stench of an animal. It was the smell of ozone, hard radiation, and a strange metallic spice. It was the scent of a creature born to conquer. She looked down at the armor. For a long time, the hangar was so quiet Cole could hear the coolant dripping from a severed pipe 50 yards away. The Sovereign reached out a massive, heavily armored hand. Her claws, sharp enough to sever steel, traced the jagged, ugly edge of the depleted uranium scales Cole had bolted to her chest plate. She tapped the human metal. It didn't sing like kaolin alloy. It just gave a dull, heavy, dead sound. She pressed harder. The kinetic dampeners underneath groaned, taking the pressure, shifting slightly before pushing back, absorbing the force perfectly. The Sovereign turned her massive head toward Cole. Her 4 amber eyes narrowed. The Overseer scrambled up from the floor, drawing a sidearm. He screeched in the kaolin tongue, aiming the weapon at Cole's head. He was going to execute the human to appease the Queen's wrath. Cole tensed, his grip on the spanner tightening. If he was going to die, he was going to throw the heavy wrench right at the Overseer's milky eye. The Sovereign moved with a speed that defied her mass. She didn't look at the Overseer, she simply backhanded him. The back of her wrist caught the kaolin commander in the chest. The sound of his carapace shattering was like a bundle of dry wood, snapping in half. The Overseer flew backward 20 feet, crashing into a stack of empty fuel crates. He didn't get up. The royal guards didn't flinch. The Sovereign turned back to the armor. She grasped the heavy breastplate with both hands and lifted it. She unclasped her ceremonial robes, letting them fall to the greasy floor, and pressed the armor to her chest. The internal biolocks engaged, sinking into the ports on her natural chitin with a sickening shh sound. She stood there, wearing the patchwork monstrosity, half sleek, alien perfection, half brutal, ugly human engineering. She brought her right fist down against her own chest, striking the uranium plating with tremendous force. Bang! The sound echoed through the massive bay. The uranium scales shifted slightly. The kinetic dampeners absorbed the massive impact. The energy dissipated outward. The Sovereign didn't even stumble. The force that should have cracked her ribs had simply vanished into the human suspension system. She struck herself again, harder. Bang! Nothing. The Sovereign lowered her fist. She looked down at the ugly grey slabs of metal bolted to her chest. Then she looked at Cole. She opened her mandibles. The roar that tore from her throat wasn't just loud, it was a physical force. It shattered the reinforced synth glass of the upper observation deck, raining crystalline shards down onto the hangar floor like snow. It vibrated in Cole's teeth, rattled his ribcage, and forced him to squeeze his eyes shut against the sheer acoustic pressure. The roar ended, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The Sovereign stepped closer to Cole. She was so close he could see the intricate micro-fractures in her amber eyes. When she spoke, her voice was filtered through a translation collar at her throat. It sounded like grinding granite and tearing metal. "Who fixed my armor?" she bellowed. The question hung in the air, thick and terrifying. Cole swallowed hard. His throat felt like dust. He looked at the royal guards, their hands twitching near their weapons. He looked at the unconscious Overseer bleeding out on the floor. He looked at Dean, who was whimpering into the deck plates. Cole took a breath. His chest hurt. He was so tired. He wiped a smear of grease off his cheek with the back of his blistered hand. He didn't drop the spanner. "I did," Cole said, his voice cracked, rough, and entirely unimpressive. The Queen stared at him, unblinking. "I did," Cole repeated, finding his footing, the bitter cynicism clawing its way up his throat. He pointed the spanner at her chest. "Because your engineers are idiots. You can't just put a wall in front of a plasma charge and hope it holds. You have to break the kinetic wave." He expected her to kill him. He expected a plasma bolt through the stomach. His heart hammered wildly, a desperate bird trapped in his chest, betraying his calm facade. The Sovereign leaned down. Her massive face was inches from Cole's. He could smell the ozone on her breath. "It is hideous," the translator barked, capturing the disdain in her native chitter. "Yeah," Cole rasped, not breaking eye contact, though every instinct told him to look away. "But it works. I'm an engineer, not an artist. You want pretty? Go ask the guy you just threw across the room. You want to survive the next firefight? Keep my ugly plates on." The tension in the hangar was a physical weight. Cole felt sweat trace a cold line down his spine. He had pushed it too far. The arrogance of humanity distilled into a dirty mechanic talking back to an alien god. The Sovereign slowly stood to her full height. She looked at her chest plate again, running a claw over the harsh, unpolished steel of the human bolts. Then the Sovereign did something that made the royal guards stiffen in absolute shock. She let out a low, rhythmic clicking sound from the back of her throat. It was rough, jarring, and entirely alien, but the translation collar caught it, and a mechanized, synthetic laugh echoed through Hangar Bay 4. "You speak the truth, little mechanic," she rumbled. "My engineers build monuments. They have forgotten how to build shields." She turned her massive head toward the captain of her guard. She issued a rapid, clicking command. The captain bowed, then pointed at Cole. "You are no longer a slave of Hangar 4, the Sovereign declared, her voice echoing in the dead silence of the bay. "You will board my vessel. The front lines are brutal, and my warriors die because their armor breaks. You will make their armor ugly." Cole stared at her. The exhaustion in his bones was suddenly warring with a new terrifying reality. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't free either. He had just been drafted by the enemy because he was too good at his job. "I need my tools," Cole said, his voice flat. "And I need him." He pointed the spanner down at Dean, who was still trembling on the floor. "He's my assistant. I don't work without him." The Sovereign glanced at Dean. She clicked indifferently. "Take the frail one. Take your tools. We burn for the core worlds in 1 hour." She turned and marched back toward her shuttle, the ugly, jagged plates of depleted uranium on her chest shifting flawlessly with every heavy step. Cole watched her go. He felt a tug on his pant leg. Dean was looking up at him, his face a mask of awe and sheer terror. "Cole, what did you just do?" Cole sighed, his shoulders slumping. He looked down at the heavy steel spanner in his hand, feeling the blistered raw skin of his palm. "I think," Cole muttered, dropping the spanner into his toolbox with a loud clatter, "I just got a promotion." The interior of the Kalan dreadnought, the Apex, did not feel like a machine. It felt like a digestive tract. Cole stood in the center of the massive orbital forge, a sprawling cavern of a room located deep in the ship's armored ventral spine. The air here was 10 degrees hotter than the hangar bay, thick with a suffocating humidity that clung to the skin like a wet sheet. It smelled of rotting vegetation, scorched carbon, and the sharp, acidic tang of kaolin bioresin. The walls weren't riveted steel. They were vast expanses of dark, ribbed chitin that pulsed faintly with the ship's immense power core. Dean was violently sick in a corner grating. He had been throwing up bile for 10 minutes. Cole ignored him, walking a slow circle around the heavy work table that dominated the center of the forge. His boots stuck slightly to the resin-coated deck. The Kalan hadn't just given him a workspace. They had evicted their own armorers to make room. Cole could still see the claw marks in the deck, plating where the previous occupants had been dragged out by the Sovereign's royal guard. "Get up, Dean," Cole said. His voice sounded flat, swallowed entirely by the cavernous organic acoustics of the room. "I can't," Dean gasped, wiping a string of saliva from his chin. He was shivering despite the sweltering heat. "The gravity, the smell. Cole, they're going to eat us. They just brought us up here to keep the meat fresh." "If they wanted to eat us, they wouldn't have brought my toolbox." Cole kicked his heavy steel case. It chimed against the deck, a harsh, undeniably human sound that felt entirely out of place in the alien room. He popped the latches. The familiar scent of machine oil and cold iron wafted up, momentarily cutting through the alien stench. It was a small anchor to sanity. A heavy pneumatic door at the far end of the forge slid open with a wet, tearing sound. A Kalan entered. It wasn't a warrior, but a massive, hunchbacked caste with elongated, multi-jointed upper limbs. A forge master. It wore a heavy harness of blackened metal and carried a data pad that looked absurdly small in its massive claws. The forge master stopped a few feet from Cole. It towered over him, its mandibles clicking in a rapid, agitated rhythm. It reeked of sulfur. "I don't speak bug," Cole said, pulling a heavy pneumatic rivet gun from his box. He checked the pressure gauge. Empty. He tossed it onto the table with a clatter. The forge master reached up and tapped a silver node embedded in its throat. A burst of static hissed, followed by a crude, digitized voice. "You deface the sacred resin. You pollute the armory with dead metal." "I make things work," Cole countered, leaning his hip against the work table. He crossed his arms, refusing to look up at the creature's face, staring instead at the thick, unprotected joints of its midsection. "Your sovereign seemed to like my dead metal?" The forge master let out a low, rumbling hiss that rattled the loose tools in Cole's box. "The sovereign ordered me to supply you. What do the frail hands require to ruin our perfection?" Cole didn't blink. He had survived 3 years in the labor camps by understanding one fundamental truth about the Kalan. They respected only leverage. Right now, Cole held the Queen's favor. It was a fragile, terrifying shield, but he had to wield it like a sledgehammer. "Everything," Cole said. "Specify." I need ablative compounds. I need heavy raw tungsten. I need shock gel, the kind you use in your main artillery dampeners. And I need a plasma lathe that doesn't run on your biological sludge. Find me a human reactor core. I know you've got dozens sitting in your salvage bays. The Forge Master bristled, its upper plates flaring out in an aggressive display. Human scrap is weak. It breaks. Yeah, that's the point, Cole said, picking up a heavy tungsten grinding wheel. It breaks, so the guy inside doesn't. Now go get it. Before I tell the Sovereign, her Forge Master is refusing a direct royal decree. The alien stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. The sheer physical threat radiating from the creature was enough to make the hair on Cole's arms stand up, but the Forge Master eventually lowered its plates. It turned on its heavy heels and lumbered out of the room. Dean crawled up from the floor, leaning heavily against a chitinous pillar. You're insane. You're actively trying to get us killed. I'm trying to set a baseline, Cole muttered, turning his attention to the alien terminals. They were tactile, requiring pressure and heat to operate. He hated them. If we act like slaves, they'll treat us like slaves. If we act like the chief engineers of this ship, they might just leave us alone long enough to figure out how not to die. And when they bring us their armor? Dean asked, his voice cracking. What then? We don't even know what we're fighting. Cole ran a calloused thumb over the edge of his rivet gun. We fix it, we make it ugly, and we pray to God it holds. They didn't have to wait long to find out what the Kalan were fighting. 48 hours after leaving the core worlds, the Apex dropped out of warp space. The entire ship shuddered violently, throwing Cole into the edge of his workbench. The heavy, rhythmic thrum of the ship's weapon batteries began immediately, vibrating through the floorboards and vibrating into Cole's teeth. 4 hours later, the forge doors blew open. 6 Kalan warriors were dragged in by the ship's medical drones. They were massive, brutal things, bred for frontline shock assaults. But right now, they were meat. Cole froze, his grip tightening on a coil of aramid fiber weave. The Kalan armor, the beautiful, monolithic purple chitin that was supposed to be impervious, was shredded. It looked like someone had run it through a massive, industrial wood chipper. Deep, jagged craters marred their chest plates. Thick fluorescent blue blood pooled onto the deck, steaming in the forge's heat. By God, Dean whispered, backing away, his hands flying to his mouth. What did that? Cole didn't back away. He forced his legs to move, walking toward the closest warrior. The alien was groaning, a low, mechanical sound of absolute agony. Cole crouched beside the massive alien, ignoring the sickening stench of burning blue blood. He ran his gloved hand over the wounds in the armor. Kinetics, Cole said, his voice tight. High-velocity, hyperdense kinetic penetrators, railguns maybe? He pried a jagged shard of metal from the alien's chest cavity. It was a dark, ugly alloy, shaped like a vicious arrowhead. It hadn't melted the armor. It had shattered it through sheer, overwhelming kinetic transfer. The Kalan's monolithic plates had cracked like porcelain under the impact, driving shards of their own armor inward. The Forge Master entered the room, surveying the carnage with a cold, unblinking stare. The resistance forces on Aegis Prime. They use band kinetic accelerators. Our plates hold against energy, but the kinetics, they splinter the resin. Because your resin is too hard, Cole snapped, dropping the bloody metal shard onto the deck. It has no give. You build a glass wall and act surprised when someone throws a rock through it. The Sovereign demands these warriors return to the front. They must not fall. The Forge Master didn't ask. It commanded. The medical drones dragged the wounded aliens onto heavy hydraulic racks, exposing their shattered carapaces. Cole looked at Dean. The ex-architect was shaking, his eyes wide with panic. Cole, we can't. This is biology, not mechanics. We're not surgeons. We're not fixing the bugs. We're fixing the shell, Cole barked. The sheer adrenaline was stripping away his exhaustion, leaving only a cold, mechanical focus. Dean, get the rotary saws. Strip away the damaged chitin, all of it. Cut it back to the bioports. I can't, Dean cried, staring at the pooling blue blood. Cole crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbed Dean by the collar of his jumpsuit, and slammed him hard against the chitinous wall. The impact knocked the breath from the smaller man's lungs. Listen to me, Cole hissed, his face inches from Dean's. If these warriors die, the Sovereign vents this room. You want to survive? You stop looking at the blood and start looking at the structural integrity. They are machines, Dean. Just fleshy, ugly machines. Now get the saw. He dropped Dean, turned and grabbed his plasma cutter. For the next 12 hours, the forge was a slaughterhouse of sparks, shrieking metal, and the sickening smell of cauterized alien flesh. Cole worked with a brutal, frantic efficiency. He couldn't bond the alien resin, so he tore it out. He used heavy rotary saws to carve away the elegant, curved chest plates of the warriors, exposing the thick, fleshy musculature beneath. The warriors didn't scream. Their pain receptors were chemically dampened by the medical drones, but they twitched, massive muscles spasming against the restraints. Cole ignored it. He was in the zone, his mind reducing the horror before him to pure mathematics and material science. He took the thick slabs of raw tungsten he had extorted from the forge master. Tungsten was too heavy for a human to wear into battle, but for a Kalan, it was nothing. He didn't forge it into solid plates. He cut it into thick, hexagonal tiles. "Spalling liners!" Cole yelled over the deafening whine of the saws. "Dean, glue the aramid weave to the back of the tungsten tiles. Layer it thick." He built a matrix. He bolted the heavy tungsten tiles directly to the underlying structural harness of the warriors. Between the rigid tiles, he injected the thick, gelatinous shock gel the Kalan used in their artillery dampeners. It was an ablative, reactive matrix. When a hyperkinetic railgun round hit the new armor, the tungsten tile would shatter, destroying the round's shape and penetrating power. The shock gel behind it would instantly disperse the sheer kinetic force across the entire chest cavity, preventing internal hemorrhaging. The aramid weave would catch any resulting shrapnel. It was heavy. It was blocky. It completely destroyed the terrifying, streamlined silhouette of the Kalan warriors, turning them into walking, jagged boulders of raw, unpolished human steel. By the time the last bolt was driven home, Cole's arms were trembling so violently he dropped his heavy pneumatic wrench. It clattered against the blood-stained deck. Cole leaned against a bulkhead, gasping for air. His jumpsuit was soaked in sweat, grease, and fluorescent blue alien blood. His hands were a mass of new blisters and old weeping sores. The 6 warriors stood up from the hydraulic racks. They moved stiffly, adjusting to the sudden, brutal weight of the human metal grafted to their chests. They looked down at themselves, their mandibles clicking in confusion and disgust. They were no longer elegant predators. They were moving fortresses. The forge master stared at them, its 4 eyes narrowing. "They are slow. They are hideous. They are alive," Cole rasped, wiping sweat from his eyes with a bloody forearm. "Drop them back down there. Let's see if your enemies can chew through an inch of spaced tungsten." The observation monitors in the forge were blurry, displaying a highly compressed optical feed from the combat zone on Aegis Prime. The UI was alien, jagged runic scripts and shifting colors that made Cole's head ache, but the visual of the battlefield was clear enough. Aegis Prime was a dust bowl, a ruined mining colony where a human splinter faction had dug in, using stolen mining equipment and hyper-accelerated railguns to hold off the Kalan advance. Cole sat on an overturned crate, a lukewarm ration pouch resting forgotten on his knee. Dean stood behind him, clutching a rusted spanner to his chest like a talisman, his eyes fixed on the screen. "We're outfitting the enemy," Dean whispered, his voice hollow. "Cole? Those are humans down there. They're fighting for their homes, and we just gave the monsters better armor." Cole's jaw tightened, the muscle feathered in his cheek. He stared at the screen, watching the 6 heavily modified Kalan warriors lumber out of their dropship into the swirling red dust of the colony. "I know what we're doing, Dean," Cole said. His voice was a dead, flat rasp. "Then how can you—" "Because if I don't, we die," Cole interrupted, turning his head just enough to glare at the older man. "You think I want to do this? You think I like grafting tank treads onto alien foot soldiers? I'm doing the math, Dean. The Kalan are going to take this rock whether these 6 bugs survive or not. But if our armor fails, the Sovereign will put a plasma bolt through my skull and feed you to the engine core. I choose us." He turned back to the monitor. He hated himself for it. The deep, cynical pragmatism that had kept him alive for 3 years felt suddenly like ashes in his mouth. He was a collaborator, a survivor. There was a razor-thin line between the two, and Cole was bleeding all over it. On the screen, the skirmish erupted. The human resistance had set up an ambush in a narrow canyon of red rock. As the Kalen squad advanced, the canyon walls lit up with the blinding hypersonic flashes of railgun fire. Cole leaned forward, his breath catching in his throat. This was it. Physics versus physics. The lead Kalen warrior took a direct hit to the chest. The kinetic force of a railgun round, moving at Mach 6, was enough to liquefy the organs of anything it hit. On the monitor, the impact was a violent, dusty explosion. The massive alien was physically thrown backward, its feet lifting off the ground. Crack! Cole winced, anticipating the sight of the shattered carapace and the fountain of blue blood. The dust cleared. The Kalen warrior was on its back, but it was moving. The hyperkinetic round had struck the central hexagonal tungsten tile. The tile had shattered spectacularly, blowing outward in a cloud of grey shrapnel, but the round hadn't penetrated. The heavy shock gel behind the tile had compressed, taking the devastating kinetic wave and spreading it across the warrior's entire torso. The aramid weave held the fractured pieces of the armor plate together. The warrior rolled over, letting out a furious clicking roar, and pushed itself back to its feet. It raised its heavy plasma cannon and fired a retaliatory blast into the canyon wall. It was a staggering, impossible sight. The Kalen infantry, used to dying instantly from those kinetic strikes, suddenly realized they were invincible. They pushed forward. Cole watched as another warrior took a hit to the shoulder, the tungsten plate shattering, the alien stumbling but immediately returning fire. They were taking hits that should have turned them into paste, and they were just walking through it. The brutal, ugly human engineering was working perfectly. Cole didn't cheer. He felt sick. He watched the red dust on the screen light up with the violet explosions of Kalen plasma fire, knowing exactly what those blasts were doing to the frail human bodies hiding in the rocks. His hands, resting on his knees, began to shake. He clenched them into fists, driving his fingernails into his blistered palms to ground himself. The heavy pneumatic doors of the forge hissed open. Cole didn't turn around. He heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of the Sovereign's footsteps. The massive alien queen walked up behind him, her presence dropping the temperature in the room by sheer, terrifying intimidation. She still wore the jagged, ugly uranium breastplate Cole had built for her back in the hangar. She stood behind him, watching the monitor. The skirmish was over. The Kalen warriors were standing victorious amidst the burning rubble of the human barricade. Their new armor was heavily cratered, missing entire tiles, leaking shock gel, and coated in dust. They looked like battered, rusted war machines, but all six were alive. The Sovereign reached out. A massive, heavily armored claw rested lightly on Cole's shoulder. The weight of it was immense, a physical reminder of his absolute captivity. "Hideous," the synthetic voice of her translator box rumbled through the quiet forge. "But unbreakable." Cole stared at the screen, at the smoke rising from the human positions. He felt the cold, hard reality of his situation settle into his bones like a terminal diagnosis. "Yeah," Cole whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of it. He didn't look at her. He just stared at his greasy, blistered hands. Unbreakable. For 3 weeks, the forge never slept. Cole forgot what silence sounded like. The deep, visceral thrum of the dreadnought's engines became his pulse. The shrieking grind of the tungsten saws became his breathing. He lived in a state of suspended agony, his muscles cramping into tight, hot knots that no amount of stretching could alleviate. The Kalen didn't need sleep, not the way humans did, and they expected their newly appointed armorer to match their relentless biological rhythm. He didn't. He collapsed regularly. He would pass out over his work table, his face pressed against cold, unpolished steel, only to be jolted awake by the violent, crackling sting of a medical drone's electroprod. He'd wake up tasting copper and smelling his own burnt hair, grab his pneumatic wrench with hands that felt like bags of broken glass, and start bolting plates onto the next Kalen shock trooper. Dean was gone. He hadn't died, but his mind had simply snapped under the pressure of arming the slaughterers of his own species. The ex-architect had curled into a fetal ball in the corner of the forge on day 11, weeping silently until his throat bled. The Kalen medical drones had dragged him away. Cole didn't ask where. Asking meant caring, and caring was a luxury that would get him killed. At least that's what he told himself. But every time he bolted a heavy, spalling matrix onto a warrior's chest, he saw the blurry, compressed footage of Aegis Prime. He saw the human bodies disintegrating in the red dust. He felt the phantom blood on his hands, sticky and warm, refusing to wash off no matter how hard he scrubbed his knuckles with industrial solvent. He was keeping himself alive by feeding his own kind into a meat grinder. "Another batch," the Forge Master hissed, its towering frame casting a long, oppressive shadow over Cole's workbench. It dropped a fresh, steaming pile of raw chitin and structural harnesses onto the metal grating. "The Sovereign requires 40 units by the next cycle. The assault on the human colony of Setea begins soon." Cole didn't look up. He was carefully injecting the heavy shock gel into a hollowed-out tungsten carapace. "Your troops are heavy. They're slow. The Setian militia uses rapid-fire kinetics. If you drop them in plain sight, they'll get swamped." "Their fire will break against the metal? You made it so?" "Yeah," Cole muttered. "I made it so." He watched the thick, translucent gel ooze into the hexagonal chambers of the armor. The Kalan used this stuff in their heavy artillery to absorb the massive recoil of plasma cannons. It was a non-Newtonian fluid. Under normal pressure, it was a liquid. But when struck by sudden, extreme kinetic force, like a railgun round, it hardened instantly, turning into an impenetrable solid wall that dissipated the energy outward, saving the soft tissue underneath. It was perfect, too perfect. Cole set the injection nozzle down. His thumb traced the edge of the tungsten tile. He was an engineer, and the first rule of engineering was that every system, no matter how flawless, had a tolerance limit. If you pushed a material past its intended parameter, it didn't just fail, it reacted violently. Cole looked at the barrel of raw shock gel sitting by the pneumatic press. Then he looked at the crate of standard Kalan bioresin solvent, a highly acidic compound used to clean the tools. If you mix the solvent into the gel, it wouldn't change the immediate physical properties. It would still act as a non-Newtonian fluid. It would still stop a massive kinetic strike, but the acid would break down the gel's elastic rebound memory. If a modified armor plate took a heavy hit, the gel would harden to stop it. But instead of returning to a liquid state a fraction of a second later, the acidic corruption would cause it to lock. It would crystallize permanently into a rigid, brittle block. And if a second round hit that exact same crystallized spot before the alien could move, the gel wouldn't disperse the energy outward. It would act as a solid, conductive spike, driving the entire devastating kinetic force of the second shot straight through the armor and directly into the Kalan's vital organs. It wouldn't just kill them, it would shatter them from the inside out. But it required the humans to know the trick. They had to stop aiming for center mass with single, heavy shots. They had to switch to double tap bursts, grouping 2 rounds into the exact same hex tile within a millisecond. Cole stared at the gel, his heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, terrified bird. If the Forge Master caught him altering the chemical makeup of the armor matrix, they wouldn't just execute him, they would skin him with a sonic peeler. He wiped his greasy forehead with the back of his wrist. He looked around the forge. The heavy doors were sealed. The medical drones were clustered near the cooling racks. The Forge Master was busy inspecting a rack of plasma rifles at the far end of the cavernous room. Cole grabbed a heavy metal beaker. He filled it with the bioresin solvent. The acidic fumes immediately burned his nostrils, making his eyes water. He walked over to the barrel of shock gel. He didn't hesitate. He didn't let himself think about the consequences. He just poured the solvent into the gel, grabbed a stirring rod, and mixed it until the slight yellow tint faded back into translucent gray. He felt a cold, jagged knot form in his stomach. He was a dead man walking. "All right, you ugly bastards," Cole whispered to the empty air, picking up his injection gun again. "Let's make you invincible." The trick wasn't poisoning the armor. The trick was telling the humans where to shoot. The apex hung in high orbit over Setea, a massive blue and green jewel suspended against the black void. Down there, millions of humans were fortifying their cities, preparing for an invasion they couldn't possibly survive. The Kalan dreadnoughts were a terrifying sight, casting long, jagged shadows across the continent. Cole sat at the back of the forge, hidden behind a towering stack of discarded Kalan chest plates. He held a small, cobbled-together device in his hands. It looked like a piece of garbage, He had gutted a heavy pneumatic rivet gun, ripping out the pressurized internals and replacing them with stripped copper wiring, a stolen Kalan telemetry node, and a human shortwave radio receiver he had salvaged from a destroyed fighter ship 3 months ago. He was sweating. The heavy, humid air of the forge felt suffocating. A single drop of perspiration slid down the bridge of his nose, hanging from the tip, before dropping onto the exposed circuitry in his lap. He cursed silently, wiping the moisture away with a calloused thumb. He needed to broadcast the weakness, but the Kalan ship's internal security network was an impenetrable fortress of bio-digital encryption. If he tried to send a standard transmission, the ship's logic spiders would trace the signal back to the forge in less than 10 seconds. He had to hide the message inside something the Kalan were already transmitting. He looked over at the armor diagnostic terminal. Every time a Kalan shock trooper dropped into a combat zone, their armor transmitted a constant stream of telemetry back to the apex. Heart rate, armor integrity, heat levels, kinetic impact data. It was a massive wave of white noise. Cole spliced his rigged rivet gun into the diagnostic terminal's primary feed line. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped the tiny soldering iron twice, burning a small, blistered crescent into his own thigh. He bit the inside of his cheek until he tasted blood, forcing his breathing to slow. "Focus. Just mechanics. It's just plumbing for electricity." He connected the final wire. The terminal screen flickered, the jagged alien runes distorting for a fraction of a second before stabilizing. He tapped his own earpiece, routing the radio signal through the Kalan telemetry burst. He wasn't sending a voice message. Voice data was too heavy, too easily intercepted. He was sending a repeating pulse code. Old Earth Morse, tungsten hex, double tap, Gel locks, shatters inward, tungsten hex, double tap. He set it to loop continuously, burying the micro-burst of human code deep inside the massive, localized data streams of the Kalan dropships. Any human military comms operator listening to the static of the Kalan frequencies would catch the rhythmic anomaly. Whether they understood it or trusted it was entirely out of his hands. A heavy, wet footstep sounded directly behind him. Cole's blood turned to ice. He shoved the gutted rivet gun behind the stack of discarded armor and spun around, grabbing a rusted spanner from the floor. The Forge Master loomed over him, its 4 amber eyes narrowed, focusing on the diagnostic terminal. The creature's heavy mandibles clicked in a slow, threatening rhythm. It smelled of burnt ozone and suspicion. "You alter the data streams. The logic spiders detect an anomaly in the armor telemetry." Cole tightened his grip on the spanner. He was cornered. There was no clever way out of this. If the Forge Master pulled the logs, the execution would be immediate. "I'm adjusting the feedback loop," Cole lied, his voice sounding entirely too loud in the quiet forge. He stepped sideways, physically blocking the alien's view of the terminal's lower access panel. "Your telemetry assumes standard Kalan biology. The shock gel matrix changes the thermal dissipation rate. If I don't alter the feedback threshold, your monitors are going to think every single trooper is having a cardiac arrest the second they hit the ground." The Forge Master leaned down. The sheer mass of the creature was terrifying. It exhaled, blowing a wave of hot, sulfurous breath across Cole's face. "You speak in circles, dead metal worker. The armor does not overheat." "It does. When you strap 3 inches of tungsten to it, you ignorant bastard," Cole snapped. The fear suddenly gave way to a blinding, defensive rage. He was exhausted, he was terrified, and he was sick of being bullied by a giant bug that didn't know the difference between tensile strength and sheer stress. He slammed his spanner against the nearest metal crate. The sharp, cracking noise made the Forge Master flinch back slightly. "You want me to undo it?" Cole yelled, pointing the wrench at the massive alien's chest. "Fine, but when your sovereign screens light up with false positive death rattles, and she comes down here to ask why the command deck is blind, you can tell her you interrupted my diagnostic calibration." The Forge Master bristled, its upper plates flaring out. It raised a massive, clawed hand. Cole braced himself, fully expecting his head to be separated from his shoulders. But the blow never came. A deep synthetic siren began to howl through the apex. The ambient lighting in the forge snapped from amber to blood red. The floor vibrated as the primary launch tubes engaged. "The invasion commences," the Forge Master hissed, lowering its hand. "Pray your dead metal holds, human, or the Sovereign will ensure you do not die quickly." The alien turned and lumbered toward the massive observation screens at the front of the forge. Cole slumped back against the metal crates, his knees threatening to buckle. He reached behind his back, his fingers brushing the crude, hidden wire of his transmitter. The pulse was still looping. He closed his eyes, listening to the violent, rhythmic shudder of the dropships launching from the belly of the dreadnought. I gave you the key, Cole thought, the cynicism finally cracking, replaced by a desperate, hollow hope. Please, God, let someone be listening. The observation screens in the forge showed a slaughter. The Kalan dropships hit the outskirts of the Satian capital city like meteors, tearing through the human anti-air defenses. As the ramps dropped, hundreds of heavily modified Kalan shock troopers poured into the ruined streets. Cole watched the monitors from his workbench, his chest tight. The forge master stood a few yards away, its hands clasped behind its back, a posture of smug, predatory satisfaction. The human defenders were heavily entrenched. As the Kalan advanced down a massive, shattered boulevard, the windows of the ruined skyscrapers lit up with the stroboscopic flashes of heavy kinetic suppressive fire. Hundreds of hyper-accelerated tungsten rounds tore down into the alien ranks. The Kalan didn't even break stride. The heavy, ugly human plates Cole had bolted to their chests took the hits. The tungsten hex tiles shattered violently, sending clouds of grey shrapnel into the air. But the corrupted shock gel underneath absorbed the impacts. The aliens staggered beneath the kinetic blows, but they didn't fall. They raised their plasma cannons and began systematically vaporizing the human sniper nests. It was a massacre. The Satian militia was falling back in a blind panic, their weapons completely useless against the walking fortresses. Perfection, the forge master rumbled, pointing a claw at the screen. Your dead metal serves the Empire well. The frail ones die in their own traps. Cole didn't answer. He stared at the telemetry data scrolling rapidly down his terminal. The heart rates of the Kalan troopers were perfectly steady. The armor integrity was holding. The transmission was failing. Nobody had heard the pulse, or nobody understood it. He had doomed an entire world just to buy himself a few more weeks of life in a sweltering cage. Cole gripped the edge of the workbench, his knuckles turning white. A heavy, sickening weight settled in his stomach. This was it. This was the legacy of humanity's finest engineer, building a better boot for the Kalan to crush us with. Suddenly, the human fire on the main screen ceased entirely. The Kalan troopers paused, confused by the sudden silence. The dust settled in the ruined boulevard. The alien commanders barked orders, their plasma cannons sweeping the empty windows. Then a single, sharp sound cracked over the battlefield audio feed. Crack, crack. It wasn't the chaotic, sustained roar of suppressive fire. It was a precise, measured, two-round burst from a heavy antimaterial rifle. On the screen, a Kalan shock trooper standing in the center of the street jerked backward. The first round hit dead center on a tungsten hex tile, shattering it and compressing the shock gel. A fraction of a millisecond later, exactly as the gel locked into a rigid, crystalline spike, the second round struck the exact same point. The Kalan trooper didn't stagger. It exploded. The sheer kinetic force of the second round drove the crystallized gel straight through the alien's ribcage like a solid steel javelin. The heavy monolithic backplate of the Kalan armor blew outward in a geyser of blue blood and shattered chitin. The massive warrior collapsed to the pavement, dead before it even hit the ground. The forge master let out a deafening shriek of shock. Crack, crack. Another trooper fell, its chest cavity completely pulverized. Crack, 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 crack. The street erupted. The human defenders had stopped spraying and praying. They had switched to synchronized dual-impact snipers. They were aiming for the dead center of the hex tiles, exploiting the fatal flaw Cole had built into the matrix. The invincible armor was suddenly a death trap. Every hit that didn't kill an alien instantly locked their gel matrix, turning their protective padding into a fragile, lethal liability. The Kalan lines broke. The absolute panic among the shock troopers was visible, even through the blurry optics. They tried to retreat, but the heavy tungsten plates made them too slow to outrun the human snipers. Cole let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 3 weeks. A slow, bitter smile cracked his grime-stained face. He leaned back against the workbench, the sheer relief washing over him like cold water. "What is this?" the forge master bellowed. turning its massive head toward Cole. Its eyes were wide with fury. "Why does the metal fail? Why does the resin shatter?" "It's a resonance cascade," Cole lied smoothly, not caring anymore. He was dead, but he was taking thousands of them with him. They found the harmonic frequency of the shock gel. They're breaking it from the inside. The heavy doors of the forge suddenly shrieked open. The ambient noise in the room died instantly. The sovereign stepped through the threshold. She did not wear her ceremonial robes. She was clad in the jagged, ugly uranium breastplate Cole had built for her. But her posture was not one of victory. It was rigid with pure, unadulterated rage. Her royal guards flooded the room behind her, their energy halberds ignited and humming with lethal power. The forge master immediately dropped to its belly, groveling against the metal grating. "My queen, the human metal is corrupted. The frail ones use forbidden weapons." The sovereign ignored him. She walked directly toward Cole. Every step she took shook the deck plates. Cole didn't back away. He stood up straight, wiping his hands on his ruined jumpsuit. He was out of plays. The bluff was over. He looked the towering alien god in her four glowing eyes and waited for the execution. The sovereign stopped inches from him. She reached out, her massive claw wrapping around his throat. She didn't squeeze, but the sheer threat of her grip made it impossible to breathe deeply. She lifted him slightly, forcing him onto his toes. "You built a back door into my invincible army," the translation collar at her throat growled, the mechanized voice dripping with malice. "You engineered a flaw. You fed it to your kind." Cole choked, his hands instinctively gripping her massive armored wrist. The cold, unyielding alien metal dug into his calluses. "I built what you asked for," he rasped, fighting for air. "I built armor that survives the first hit. I never promised it would survive the second." The sovereign's amber eyes bored into his. She could crush his windpipe with a twitch of her finger. She could vent the room. She could hand him to the interrogators. But she didn't. Slowly, deliberately, the sovereign lowered Cole back to the deck and released his throat. Cole staggered, coughing violently, leaning against the workbench to keep from collapsing. He looked up at her, utterly bewildered. The sovereign looked at the monitor. The Kalan forces were in full retreat, leaving hundreds of massive, heavily armored corpses in the ruins of Setea. "My engineers build monuments. You build traps," she said softly, the mechanical voice devoid of its earlier fury, replaced by a cold, terrifying calculation. "You sacrifice the integrity of my vanguard to send a message to your people. It is a tactical cruelty that I respect." Cole stared at her, his throat burning. "You're not going to kill me?" The sovereign turned back to him. She reached up and tapped the jagged, ugly uranium plate on her own chest. "Your design failed on the battlefield, mechanic, but my chest plate remains whole. You will redesign the ablative matrix. You will remove the flaw, and you will ensure my army never falls to this human trick again." She leaned down, her mandibles clicking near his ear. "If you do not, I will execute you. If you sabotage it again, I will burn the world below to glass. But if you fix it, I will let you live to see how your ingenuity conquers the galaxy in my name." The sovereign turned and swept out of the forge, her guards falling in line behind her. Cole was left standing in the sweltering heat, the deafening thrum of the ship's engines wrapping around him. He looked at his blistered, greasy hands. He had won the battle. He had saved millions of lives on Setea. But the war wasn't over. He was still in the belly of the beast. He was still the Queen's armorer. He walked over to his toolbox, the heavy metal case scarred and beaten. He popped the latches. The familiar scent of machine oil and cold iron wafted up. He reached in, his fingers wrapping around the cold, heavy steel of his favorite spanner. Cole looked up at the monitors, watching the smoke rise from the human city, and then turned toward the towering stack of raw Kalan chitin. "All right," Cole whispered into the sweltering dark, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 cynical compromises and one unbreakable spirit. "Let's see what else I can break." If you loved feeling the heat of the forge and the sheer tension of Cole's desperate gamble, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Cole managed to sabotage the alien war machine and survive the Sovereign's wrath, but his real battle as the captive architect of the Kalan Armada is only just beginning. Share this video with a fellow sci-fi fan and drop a comment below. Would you have risked it all to send the transmission or played it safe to survive? Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next epic installment. Stay human and stay awesome.